I just smiled and kept cutting my steak. My sister-in-law was mid-sentence, explaining to the table why I probably wouldn't understand the concept of quarterly earnings reports. I nodded slowly, the way you do when someone is talking and you've already decided not to correct them. Not yet, anyway. That night at my mother-in-law's dining room table there were 12 people. My husband's family took up most of the seat. His brother, his brother's wife, the one currently explaining finance to me, his parents, 2 cousins, an uncle from out of town, and a few people I'd met maybe twice before and still couldn't place. I was the only one at that table who didn't share their last name. I had been coming to these dinners for 7 years. 7 years of "oh, you work in medicine, that must be nice," said in the tone that meant how quaint. 7 years of my mother-in-law redirecting conversations away from anything I said. 7 years of my sister-in-law Tamsin asking me questions she didn't actually want the answers to. Questions like, do you even invest, and have you ever owned property? And, once, memorably at Thanksgiving 3 years ago, isn't it hard working with sick people all day? I could never do something so depressing. I always said something polite. I smiled. I helped clear the table. My husband Owen, wait, no, that name's taken. My husband, I'll call him what his family calls it, which is by his last name Hargrove. Hargrove would squeeze my hand under the table sometimes. A small thing. I know, I'm sorry, just a little longer squeeze. And I would squeeze back because I loved him, and because I understood that families are complicated, and because I genuinely believed, for 6 of those 7 years, that it would get easier. It didn't. The dinner where this story really starts was in March. Hargrove's uncle, a man named Kitten, who smelled like expensive cologne and made his money in commercial real estate, had flown in from Dallas to celebrate something vague having to do with a deal closing. The mood was celebratory in that specific way wealthy families celebrate, controlled, performative, the good wine out but not the best wine. Tamsin's husband, a man named Beckett, worked in private equity. He had the kind of jawline that television teaches you to trust, and the kind of opinions that remind you why you shouldn't. That night he was explaining why the housing market was actually good if you thought about it correctly, which most people didn't, and several people at the table were nodding. I was not nodding. You're in healthcare, right? Beckett said, turning to me. Not because he'd forgotten, I'd told him 4 times, but because he needed an audience he could explain things to. So you probably see a lot of the downstream effects. Patients who can't afford things. I do, I said. Must be hard, he said in that Thanksgiving voice. Watching people suffer because of systemic failures you can't control. I picked up my wine glass. I manage. Tamsin laughed a little, not at anything funny. Just the sound she made when she wanted to close a topic. Sloan works at a clinic, she said to Kitten who hadn't asked. One of those community health places. I didn't correct her. I do work at a clinic. That part is true. What Tamsin had decided, somewhere in the 7 years of knowing me, was that clinic meant something small, something neighborhood, something that a person like her went to before they found a real doctor. What she'd never asked, and I'd never volunteered, was what kind of clinic, what I actually did there, what my title was, what I'd done before that or during my residencies, or the 2 years I spent doing something she would find either impressive or disturbing depending on her mood. Families fill in the blanks of people they've decided not to know. Kitten raised his glass toward me, magnanimous. To community service, he said, like I was running a food pantry. I raised mine back. Thank you. The conversation moved on. Hargrove's hand found mine under the table. I let him hold it. 3 weeks later, Beckett's firm ran into trouble. I don't mean that maliciously. I mean that 3 weeks later, Hargrove called me on my lunch break, which I was eating at my desk between a budget review and a conference call I'd already pushed twice, to tell me that Beckett's largest fund was under SEC scrutiny. Nothing confirmed. Just whispers, the kind that move through financial circles fast. He called to ask if you know anyone, Hargrove said. He sounded careful, like he knew how the sentence would land. I set my sandwich down. Anyone at the SEC? Yeah. I was quiet for a moment. Through my office window I could see the parking lot, the row of reserved spaces, the afternoon light going flat over the concrete. Does Tamsin know he called you? I asked. She was in the room, okay. I picked up my sandwich again. Tell him I'll think about it. I want to be clear about something. I genuinely considered helping. Not because I owed Beckett anything. and not because Tamsin had ever been kind to me, but because Hargrove loved his sister, and I loved Hargrove, and sometimes love is a series of choices that look different from the outside than they feel from the inside. But there was another reason I paused before saying yes. There were things about my work that Beckett and Tamsin didn't know. Things about the nature of the calls I was sometimes on, the meetings I sometimes attended, the way certain federal agencies and my particular department had, over the past several years, developed what you'd call a working relationship. A relationship that, if I made the wrong phone call for the wrong reasons, could become something much more complicated than a favor between in-laws. I didn't say any of that to Hargrove. I just said, let me look into it. The dinner to celebrate Clifton's deal had been at a restaurant this time, the kind with leather menus and no prices listed, because Hargrove's mother, Adele, believed in marking occasions. We were 8 people at a round table in a private room that smelled like cedar and old money, and I wore the dress Hargrove liked, the navy one, because I'd had a long week and I wanted at least one thing to feel easy. Clifton was in a good mood. He'd had 2 bourbons before we sat down, and he was the expansive, generous version of himself that I imagined he'd been as a younger man. He asked Hargrove about work, asked Beckett about the fund. Beckett's expression did something careful and then smoothed back out, and then turned to me. So, he said, Sloane, Hargrove tells me you've been very busy. Always, I said. The clinic keeping you on your toes. I smiled. Across the table, Tamsin was inspecting the bread basket. Adele was listening in that precise way she had, where she appeared not to be listening at all. Among other things, I said. Clifton nodded, the nod of a man who considers other people's jobs to be mostly decorative. I respect it, he said. Healthcare's a mess. Somebody's got to be in the trenches. Somebody does, I agreed. I wasn't going to say anything else. I genuinely was not going to say anything else. I had made it 7 years on the strategy of saying very little, and it had worked, and the plan was to continue. But then Tamsin looked up from the bread basket and said, not to me, to the table, the way she said most things she wanted me to hear. I just think it's interesting that you spend all this time around medical people and you still can't get good advice when you actually— She meant the SEC thing, she meant Beckett. She was unhappy about something, and I was a convenient place to put it. Hargrove went very still. I set my fork down. What kind of advice are you looking for? I asked her. She shrugged, that elaborate shrug she did. I don't know, real advice, from people who actually understand how these things work. No offense, Sloane, but community health isn't exactly, Tamsin. Hargrove said it quietly. I'm just saying, what do you think I do? I said. The table got a specific kind of quiet. The kind that happens when someone asks a question and everyone can feel that the answer is going to be inconvenient. Tamsin looked at me directly for the first time all evening. You work at a clinic, she said. You treat patients. It's a good thing to do, I'm not. I'm the chief medical officer, I said. Of a federally designated trauma and research center affiliated with Johns Hopkins and contracted to provide consultation services to 3 federal agencies, and one of which is incidentally adjacent to the agency currently looking at your husband's fund. The table was very quiet. Clifton put his glass down. Beckett had stopped pretending to look at the menu. Adele blinked once, slowly. I didn't know that, Tamsin said. Her voice had changed. Some of the performance had gone out of it. You never asked, I said. And then, because I'm human and I'm not made of stone, I picked my fork back up and ate a bite of the salmon and let the silence be. Hargrove didn't say anything until we were in the car. We sat in the parking garage for a moment, engine running, and he was looking at the middle distance and I was looking at my hands. 7 years, he said finally. Yes. Why didn't you? Because you never asked me to, I said. And because your family had decided who I was and correcting them felt like a fight I didn't want to have at every dinner for the rest of our lives. I paused. Tonight they made me want to have it. He was quiet. Then he said, my mother is going to call you tomorrow. I know, Clifton is going to want to talk to you about, I'm aware, Tamsin, Hargrove. I turned to look at him. He looked tired and something else. Relieved maybe, in a way he didn't fully understand yet. Your sister has called me a charity worker in front of your family for 7 years. She's told people I treat poor patients. She explained the stock market to me at Christmas using small words. I watched his face. I don't need an apology from her tonight. I need you to decide whether you're on my side and I need you to know what that means going forward. He looked at me for a long moment. I've always been on your side, he said. I know you believe that, I said. But believing it and showing it aren't the same thing. He put the car in reverse. We drove home mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one we'd started with. Something had shifted. Some pressure I'd been holding in my sternum for 7 years had released a few millimeters, and I could feel the space where it had been. Adele did call. The next morning before 9, which was how I knew she'd been up thinking about it. I didn't know, she said. Which wasn't an apology, not exactly, but from Adele was close enough to one that I recognized it. I know you didn't, I said. You should have said something. I thought about all the dinners, all the redirected conversations, all the times I'd been talked over and around and through. I tried a few times, I said gently. Early on. It didn't seem to land. There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing. I want you to come to Sunday dinner, she said. Just you and Hargrove, not Tamsin, not Clifton, just us. I'd like that, I said. And I meant it. That's the thing about people who have never had to see you clearly. Sometimes when they finally do, they don't look away. Beckett's situation resolved itself in the way most SEC inquiries resolve when the underlying issue is sloppiness rather than malice. Slowly, quietly, expensively. I didn't make any calls. It wasn't my place to, and beyond that, the timeline of events had made it complicated enough that I was glad I hadn't. Whatever help he got, he found it through other channels. He never brought it up again. Neither did I. Tamsin and I are not close. I don't think we ever will be. There's too much history in the shape of what she assumed about me, and I'm not sure either of us has the energy to fully dismantle it. But something changed after the restaurant. She stopped explaining things to me. She started listening sometimes when I spoke. Small things. The size of things you don't notice until you realize they've been missing. The dinner she hosted for Adele's birthday in June. I wore a simple dress, nothing formal. We sat outside because the weather was perfect. Tamsin asked me about work. Not how is the clinic, but what is the most interesting case you've dealt with this year? An actual question. The kind with a real answer. I told her about a policy consultation I'd done for a hospital network in Ohio, something about regional trauma protocols and how they intersected with federal response timelines in underserved counties. I kept it accessible. She listened the whole time. That sounds complicated, she said when I finished. It is, I said. Why do you do it? She asked. I thought about it, genuinely. The way you think about a question when someone is actually asking it. Because there are people in rooms making decisions about health systems who have never spent a night in an ER, I said. And sometimes I can change that. She slowly. And for the first time in 7 years, Tamsin looked at me like she was seeing something she hadn't expected to find. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't the undoing of 7 years of small slights and condescension, and the particular cruelty of being made to feel invisible by people who are supposed to be your family. But it was something. Hargrove asked me once, later that summer, if I regretted waiting as long as I did. We were on the back porch. It was late, the kind of late that's almost early, and the neighborhood was quiet and the air still had that warm concrete smell from the day. Sometimes, I said, I used to think I was being patient, letting them come around, and now? I looked at the dark shape of the garden, the tomato plants I'd put in last spring and mostly neglected, but that had somehow still produced something. Now I think I was protecting them from the discomfort of having to revise who they thought I was, I said. Which wasn't generous, it was just easier. For who? For all of us, I said, but mostly for me. He reached over and took my hand. He does this thing where he doesn't say anything, just hold your hand like the conversation can wait, like there's no hurry. You know what I think? He said eventually. What? I think you'd already decided those rooms were never going to have room for you, he said. So you made yourself small enough to fit in the corners, and you got so good at it you forgot it wasn't the whole of you. I was quiet for a moment. Somewhere down the street a sprinkler clicked on. When did you get this insightful? I said. I've been practicing, he said. I laughed. The real kind, the kind that comes up without warning. The stars were out, faint through the city light, and the tomatoes were doing their determined, improbable thing in the dark, and I thought about the long work of being known by people. The real work, not the performance of it, but the actual unglamorous labor of staying in the room long enough that the truth becomes impossible to ignore. I'd spent 7 years making myself forgettable. One dinner changed what 7 years of patience couldn't, not because I finally became impressive enough. I'd been the same person the whole time, but because I finally stopped deciding, in advance, that the answer would be no. The bridges you stop defending don't always burn. Sometimes the other person walks across them when they realize what they've been missing. And sometimes you just let them.